Hi, I'm Kinkas and I'm a synth DIY guy, and welcome to today's video, which is an introduction to subtractive synthesis using the new Bullfrog synthesizer by Erica Synths. The Bullfrog is an educational synthesizer. It's made for synthesis education, so it's a great first synthesizer if you're a young person just getting into electronic music, or even an adult that just likes something with big knobs and bright colors. Either way, it's a great synthesizer, and it's a great first synthesizer because of how everything is simple and laid out very clearly. So let's have a look at the Bullfrog. It's a modular synthesizer, meaning it's composed of modules. Some might call it a semi-modular because the modules are fixed, you can't reorganize them. But since they're not normalized, and by normalized I mean there is no pre-made connection between modules, it really requires you to do all the patching with cables such as these. Therefore, for me, it qualifies as a modular synth. A semi-modular would have connections pre-made already, and this one doesn't unless you use one of the cards. Spoiler alert, we'll get to that. But anyway, as it is out of the box, nothing is connected. So that's great for learning, because you really need to make the connections yourself that will force you to understand what's going on here as far as the signal flow, right? Signal flow is the flow of control or audio information between modules as you connect them with cables. First of all, have a good look at the printed manual that comes with the Bullfrog. It's more than a manual, it's actually a full textbook about electronic sound and subtractive sound synthesis. So there's a lot of information, and it goes quite in depth into explaining things such as, for example, what sound is, right? I'll try to give you a brief description here. What we hear as sound are pressure waves being propagated through a medium, be it air, a liquid, or a solid. Usually it's air in our case, because we're not aquatic animals. But so what happens is when something vibrates, when something generates a vibration, so for example me clapping, or a guitar string, or the membrane of a drum, right, that creates a vibration. So it's a periodic vibration. It's something that's going back and forth at a certain speed. The way we measure the speed is by cycles per second, and those are called hertz. So for example, 20 hertz, which is the lowest audible frequency by humans, is 20 cycles in a second, right? That we'll hear as a note still. Below that, we start hearing it as a rhythm, right? It's tak, 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 tak. We hear the individual cycles, and that qualifies as rhythm rather than a pitch. So 20 cycles per second is 20 hertz, and humans can hear all the way up to about 20 kilohertz, especially young humans. We do lose some frequencies as we grow older. But yeah, anywhere from 20-30 hertz to 18 to 20 kilohertz, that's 1,000 hertz, right? 20,000 hertz is 20 kilohertz, is what we consider to be the human audible range. So sound for us necessarily has to exist within those frequencies. And basically, when something generates a vibration, that pushes some air molecules together and creates a high pressure zone, and the high pressure zones alternate with low pressure zones, and when those hit our eardrums, our brains interpret that periodic sound pressure variation as sound, audible sound, right? And the way that electronic instruments do that is normally by using a speaker, and a speaker has a cone that's attached to an electromagnet, and the electronic instrument, in this case a synthesizer, will create an oscillation of a voltage, right? So if a voltage goes from 0 to plus 5 volts and then back to minus 5 volts and up and down and up and down, this then gets amplified, sent to the speaker cone, and what happens is the positive voltage pushes the speaker cone forward, the negative voltage pulls it back, and as that happens at a high enough frequency to be within our audible range, the speaker cone will start generating sound pressure variations that will travel through the air and hit our ears. And that's more or less how electronic sound works. This is a very brief explanation. Look into it further if you'd like to know more about it. I just wanted to give you a brief primer in order for you to understand what's happening here. So now let's look at the Bullfrog. The first module we have is a oscillator, right? It's a voltage controlled oscillator. That's why it says VCO right here. Voltage control, that's another important principle here. We can use voltage, which you can think of as the strength of an electronic signal, right? So a 5-volt signal will be stronger than a 2-volt signal, for example, right? We use 5 volts to charge our phones, but we use 9 volts for guitar pedals, 12 volts for a synthesizer such as the Bullfrog, 15 volts maybe for a laptop charger. So different things use different voltages, but here in synthesis, in modular synthesis, we use voltages to control parameters, right? So we have certain modules that generate voltages that can be used to control other modules that receive control voltages to modulate their parameters. And modulation is just a fancy word for change. So you can change the pitch or the frequency of your oscillator by sending it a voltage. A higher voltage will give you a higher pitch, a lower voltage will give you a lower pitch. And the standard that is used in modular synthesizers, generally there are a few exceptions, but generally it's a 1 volt per octave standard. So that means this is an octave right here, right, from C to C. It includes the 7 notes of the diatonic scale plus 1, which is the repetition, an octave above, of the first one. So that's why it's called the octave, right? Because it's after the 7th. So you have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, the 7 notes, and then when you hit C again, that's now the octave, the 8th note, which is the same note as the first note, only higher in pitch. And you can keep going up, right? This keyboard actually has only 3 octaves, but you can use the octave switch over here to shift the whole keyboard up and down as needed. Now you may notice that this is a linear scale, right? Meaning you're adding votes for each octave, but we hear octaves exponentially as humans, meaning that certain note's frequency has to be multiplied by 2 to achieve the next octave, and then you multiply it by 2 again for the next octave, and so on. And so that's an exponential curve rather than a linear. So for that reason, the circuit inside the oscillator has something that's called an exponential converter, and it turns this linear voltage change coming from the keyboard into an exponential change in frequency inside the oscillator, right? Some oscillators also have linear frequency modulation inputs, but I'm pretty sure this one is also exponential. We'll look into that when we connect the keyboard. So yeah, we've talked about electronic sound, we've talked about modules and modular synthesizer, and we've talked a little bit about frequency. Just as frequency is perceived by our ears as pitch, right? A change in frequency is a change in pitch. There's also amplitude, which is perceived by us as volume, right? And for amplitude, you use the voltage controlled attenuator or voltage controlled amplifier. You can call it either way. I personally think of it more as an attenuator, because the way this works is the oscillator is always putting out a very loud wave, and what the VCA is actually doing is attenuating that so you can get silences, right? And you can get a different volume between silence and the full volume of the oscillator. You can dial that in. Some VCAs actually do amplify, some even add some distortion, but I'm pretty sure this one is just letting the sound pass through or not, depending on the voltage that you send to it or the manual control right here. The third module I'm going to talk about will be the filter. And the filter affects something called timbre, which is the quality of the sound, like the differences between the sounds that makes them recognizable. For example, when you hear a saxophone and then you hear a bass. You can tell which is which, and mostly that's because of the differences in timbre, which is basically down to the harmonic content. So the harmonics that are generated with the sound. So a saxophone has a lot of upper harmonics. So beyond just the basic note, the fundamental as we call it, you also hear a number of other notes with varying levels of amplitude, and all of those together, and this is in physics, the harmonic series is something that's observable in physics. In the real world, it's not something that man-made, it's just observable. And what makes an instrument's timbre recognizable is the arrangement and the varying amplitudes of different harmonics. Those make up the timbre of a particular instrument. So the way that we shape the timbre of a synthesizer such as this, a subtractive synthesizer, is usually by using a filter, which will cut off some of those harmonics. So this is the cutoff frequency knob. This one determines at which frequency the filter will start acting. And this is a low pass filter, meaning that it lets the low frequencies pass and cuts the high frequencies, right? There are also high pass filters, which are the opposite, and there are band pass filters, which let a narrow band of frequencies pass, so they cut both highs and lows. So there are even more different kinds of filters like notch filters, comb filters, etc. But those are the three main ones: low pass, high pass, and band pass. And this one is a low pass filter. Now there is an additional way to alter the timbre of the sound in this synthesizer, which is the wave shape, and that's within the oscillator itself. So the oscillator has two waveforms that it puts out. One is the classic sine wave, which is just the fundamental tone. It has no harmonics at all. So it's very pure note, not harsh at all. And that one actually won't be affected by the filter. The filter will just maybe turn it down in volume, because since it's not generating higher upper harmonics or overtones, you can call the harmonics overtones as well. Since it's not generating those, you know, cutting with the filter won't have any effect until you hit that fundamental note, and then what it does is just turn it down. So the oscillator has a pulse wave as well. So a pulse wave is just an up and down. It looks like a square if you have the pulse balanced, right? So that's the square wave, is basically a pulse wave where the high and the low states are equal lengths, right? But you can adjust that by adjusting the pulse width, which is this shape knob over here, affects the pulse width of the square wave and the shape of the sine. So you can move away from the perfect sine shape into some distorted shapes that have more upper harmonics and can be more interesting and will be affected by the filter, right? So let's listen to some of these waveforms. Waveforms are actually connected to these two attenuators over here. So you have the pulse attenuator and the sine wave attenuator, and you can have a mixed output over here where you can mix both of the waveforms together, as well as the built-in noise. So this machine has a noise generator as well, white noise, which is that classic like TV static sound, like shh, those kinds of sounds that are aperiodic, which means they don't have a pitch. They include all of the frequencies together, and that's in here, and it's controllable by this knob over here. You can get the noise output by itself by taking the output from here, or you can mix it in with the other waveforms, with the two waveforms from the oscillator, by using the mixer, using the mix out here. But you also have the individual outs of all three sound sources, right? The sine, the pulse, and the noise. And you can dose how much of each you want by the position of the mixer knobs over here. Now you will notice that there are also inputs for these attenuators. That means you can override their normalization by plugging something into these inputs here. So if you want to use another sound source different than the default three sound sources, you can just plug it in And you can use this as a basic mixer for anything else. You can actually connect external gear into these 3 inputs, mix them together, and have your mix out over here, which you can then send to the filter if you like, or to the VCA. Okay, so let's make our first patch. We'll get the sine wave output, and we're just going to plug it straight to the amplifier for now, right? And we can turn the amplifier up manually with the big red knob over here. Okay, you can also turn the sine wave louder if you like, okay, with the attenuator over here. We're going to leave it kind of soft for now because I'm already hearing this quite loudly. Now, if I change the pitch of the oscillator, you will hear that change. Right? If I change the frequency of the oscillator, you will hear a change in pitch. Now, I mentioned that there are voltage generators that are used to control parameters in other modules. One such voltage generator is the envelope generator. So this envelope generator will generate a voltage change over time that is determined by the attack time and the release time. So basically the voltage will ramp up from 0 volts to however high this envelope generator's voltage goes. Maybe it's 10 volts. If you have a slow attack, it'll take a long time to ramp up to those 10 volts. Right? If you have a fast attack, it'll go immediately. Once it's triggered, it has to be triggered by a gate signal. Okay? And we have a manual gate button over here that's normalized to the 2 gate inputs, one for each envelope generator. You have 2 envelope generators over here. So as you can see, when I hit the manual gate, the LED lights up. That signifies that the output is putting out a voltage, right? And if we have them very slow, you can see how the LED takes a while to ramp up to its maximum brightness, and when I let go, it takes a while to go back down to 0. So why don't we take another cable and connect the envelope generator 1 output to one of the CV inputs of the VCA, which is our voltage controlled attenuator, right? And this one has an attenuator as well, this input. If you turn it down, you won't hear anything because you're basically blocking the signal. But as you start opening this knob towards the right, you start letting the envelope generator's voltage pass into the volume control here, or the amplitude control of our VCA. So let's make this kind of a shorter attack here. So as you can hear, now when I hit the manual gate, you hear a note. When I let go, that note dies down based on my release time. If I put a faster release time here, you get silence more immediately, like that. And now I can actually use both my hands to play this patch by turning this knob for pitch changes and hitting the button to let it sound. Now that sounds very dry and boring. Thankfully, the Bullfrog has a delay. A delay is like an echo effect that simulates kind of a space. It does wonders for a synthesizer because a synthesizer generates sound completely in the electronic domain, so it doesn't have a resonant box like a guitar does, or an acoustic bass does, or a drum shell, and it's not actually happening in a room unless you make it sound through a speaker and then pick it up with a microphone. There's no kind of reverberance, no kind of ambience, so we simulate that by using the delay. So now you can hear how there's a little bit of an echo, right? I can make that echo repeat more times by turning up the feedback. And here I have the delay time control, which is how slow or quick the repetitions are. I like this. And this is the dry-wet control, meaning Dry means no effect, wet means only effect. So usually you want somewhere in between. I like it about 15 at about the 9 o'clock position. And now when I play my manual gate and turn my pitch knob, I can actually play something quite interesting and musical. If you have great ears and train a lot, you can actually play melodies this way, like right? And you can go from very low, 20 hertz, all the way to 10 kilohertz, which is super tinny and high, right? So there you have it. This can be maybe your first patch. There are patches suggested in the manual as well. Go through those, but I'll be doing this my way in this video. Now, what happens when we change the sine wave wave shape? Let's hear that. Let's make this a little drier. We hear more of the dry sound, less feedback. You hear that change? Well, that's what I mean by timbre. The quality of the sound. So the pitch is the same, the volume is the same, but we're hearing a variation in the timbre. Now, let's add the filter to this patch. So instead of the sine wave, we're going to use the pulse wave. And that sounds like this. Much more harsh, much more higher harmonics or overtones, right? So that's what makes it harsh sounding. So if we don't want it to be that harsh, instead of connecting it straight to the VCA, we'll connect it to the filter first. And right now I'm using the pulse out instead of the mixed out, so we're only hearing the pulse wave. And now we'll connect the output of our filter. VCF actually stands for voltage controlled filter. Again, the filter can also be controlled by a voltage. So let's plug this in, and now we'll turn it on. We'll hit the manual gate here and turn the filter. Hear how as I turn it towards the left, it starts sounding darker and darker. As I turn it to the right, it sounds brighter and brighter. And the resonance is a very important parameter in the filter as well, which is a feedback that emphasizes that cutoff frequency. So for example, I have it kind of high now. You can really hear how it emphasizes that sweep. If I turn down my resonance, it's a much more subtle effect, not as emphatic. In fact, if I turn down my pulse wave over here and turn the resonance all the way high, the VCF itself becomes an oscillator, a sine wave oscillator. So the feedback that's happening is actually generating an oscillation, just like this oscillator over here. So on a pinch, you actually have two oscillators available on the Bullfrog. Right, you can use the sine wave from this one so that it doesn't sound so harsh, and have this one with a high resonance so that it oscillates as well. And you could even, for example, mix them together by sending the VCF output to our pulse wave attenuator. So now this attenuator is no longer attenuating the pulse wave, it's attenuating our filter sine wave, right? And we have the sine here, and we can take the mixed output into our VCA here. We can turn the VCA up manually, and now we can hear how we have two notes happening, right? The oscillator and the filter acting as oscillator as well. But what about the voltage control for the filter? What can we use to voltage control the filter? Well, let's go back to, let's take out the sine wave here. Hey, we'll keep the mixed output here because we can just turn down whatever we don't want. So if you want just the pulse wave. Oh, and by the way, when you change the shape of the pulse wave, what you're changing is what's called the pulse width. You might have heard of pulse width modulation. And basically the pulse width, like I said, the square wave is when the high stage is the same length as the low stage. But if you make the low stage shorter and the up stage longer, you start getting variations on the pulse width, right? And that has an effect on the sound as well. So let's hear that. Right, so this is like a narrow pulse. Let's turn it up a little bit. This is a narrow pulse. This is the square wave right here. And then towards the other direction it's narrow again, but instead of the high part being narrow, the low part's being narrow, right? That's the difference between left and right sides of center. And in the middle you get this nice chunky square wave, right? So the square wave is just one position of a pulse wave, pulse width modulation parameter, and you can affect this externally as well. One way to affect it is to use the envelope generator as LFO. LFO is a low frequency oscillator. So it's an oscillator just like our blue one here, but that generates frequencies below 20 Hertz that you will not hear as notes, but you will hear them as a rhythmic or a pulsating change in whatever parameter you connect it to. So if I put this on loop, so right now it's free, which means I can trigger it independently by sending something to the gate input, by sending something to the MIDI input, or by triggering my manual gate over here, right? That triggers it right there. But if I put it in loop, now it's cycling, meaning it does the attack, it does the decay, and then re-triggers. So if I want like a slow LFO, I can just make attack and release fairly slow, right? And then I can send this voltage, and I have two outputs for each envelope generator, right? The main output is unipolar. That means it only goes from 0 volts to a positive voltage. And that's usually what you use to open up a VCA, for example, right? You have the VCA closed, you need a positive voltage to open it, a negative voltage won't really do much. But if you want to use it as an LFO, you might want to use the bipolar output. That's what BP means in this context, right? On a filter, BP usually means band pass, so don't get those confused. This means bipolar output, and it means that it's actually going through 0 down to a negative voltage and then back to a positive voltage, which is usually how oscillators work, right? This oscillator is also a bipolar oscillator, and that's what makes it not just push the speaker cone forward, but also pull it back, right? It gives you a wider range of movement for that speaker. So we'll take this, we're going to turn up our volume manually over here a little bit, and now we're going to connect our mixer to the filter, and the filter output to the amplifier, the VCA, right? And now we'll turn down that resonance so it's not oscillating by itself, so it's actually only affecting our pulse wave, see? Now, when I apply our envelope generator in loop mode, which makes it basically into an LFO, check out what happens. So we're using this voltage change that you can see in this LED right here to turn the filter cutoff up and down. So it's basically like creating an automation for the cutoff knob. Right? It's like having a little robot going up and down with this filter knob, but it's happening with voltage. And I can turn up the attenuator here to get a wider range of variation. Right? Let's turn up the resonance a little bit. Sounds super cool, right? And it can go super fast too. If I just turn both knobs of the envelope, it goes up to about audio rate, and then you get crazy effects. right? If you have the attack fast and the release slower, you get a more of like a saw kind of a shape, right? It goes up sharply and then ramps down, which can be used for rhythms. Dum, 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 dum. Very cool. What a great sounding synthesizer. It sounds as good as any high-end professional synthesizer as you will ever get. The only difference is that it's simple layout, dedicated to really learning about synthesis. So let's turn this back down. Now let's say you want to control the synthesizer with a keyboard. Well, I have my KeyStep Pro over here, and one way to control it would be to simply connect a MIDI cable from out 1 over here to the MIDI input on the Bullfrog. Since this keyboard does have analog outputs, I'm using gate and pitch outputs from the KeyStep Pro. The gate output will trigger one of the envelope generators. I can split it so that it triggers both if I want to, but for right now I only want it to trigger one, right? Which we will connect to our VCA. So the main EG1 output will go into our second CV input here, and now when I hit a key, we open up the VCA, right? We trigger the envelope generator, which in turn sends a voltage to the VCA that opens up that volume, like brings up the volume. Right? Let's make this more of a slower LFO again, the filter variation, and we'll make it more subtle. Right. Now, as you may notice that I'm playing different keys and I'm getting no pitch variation. That's because I haven't connected our pitch output of the KeyStep Pro to the 1 volt per octave input of our oscillator. So let's bring down the manual pitch control, because we're going to be controlling the pitch with the keyboard now, and connect that pitch output, and I'm using voice 2 here, so it's these outputs over here, gate, velocity, and pitch. We're only using pitch and gate for now. And there you have it. Now we're controlling the pitch of the oscillator with the keyboard. Right, and here you have your first keyboard controlled patch. Right, and right now we're affecting change to the filter via the envelope generator. It's working standalone. Since I'm not sending a gate to it, it is, and I have it in loop, it is just acting as an LFO right now, not as an envelope generator. But you can leave it free, for example, and what I can do is use a splitter cable. I can send my gate to this cable that has 2 ends now, and I can plug them to both gates, and that way when I play it, it triggers both gates and it opens the filter simultaneously with the VCA. If I make it a little slower, you can actually hear it sweep up, right? Here it goes, wow, wow. And I can make it, the VCA, stay open a little longer so we can hear that filter come back down. Okay, now let go of the key. The filter goes back down. But the note remains a little longer because we have a longer release for the VCA than we do for the filter. So the filter closes before the VCA does. Right? Now, another way to affect the filter is a different kind of voltage that I can send to it is the velocity. There's a velocity or modulation output over here. So you can set this to either be controlled by the modulation strip or by velocity, which is how fast you hit the notes, right? So if I hit very softly, you get a low voltage. If you hit it hard, you get a higher voltage. Let me get one of these right angle cables here. So what I'll do now is connect the velocity output of voice 2 of my Arturia controller. Instead of the envelope, we'll connect that to the CV input over here. And now let's hear that. So I play softly, you get a dark sound. I play strongly, you get a brighter sound. So let's make the variation a little more subtle. And suddenly you have something that's more expressive, meaning it reflects your expression. How hard you play will affect the sound of the instrument, which is how a piano, for example, works, right? If you play a piano with a lot of power, you get loud, bright sound. If you play it softly, you get a soft, darker sound. In fact, I can use a splitter on this as well and control our VCA as well as the filter, so it will not only get brighter but also louder the harder I play, right? What we need here is maybe use the bipolar output of the envelope generator and attenuate this a little bit, right? Because as I sent it the velocity voltage, it was no longer at 0, so it was open. So I'm now using the bipolar output of the envelope generator so that when the envelope is low, it's actually sending a negative voltage that will counter my velocity voltage here. Let's do a little sequence here, or maybe an arpeggiator. Each note reflects the velocity with which I played it. So you get brighter, louder notes for the ones that I hit hard. Very cool. Let's go up an octave here. Let's get some more delay happening here. Let's bring in some noise now. Remember the white noise I told you about? Hear that? See, this is just the noise here. Let's get the voltage control out of the filter here and manually turn up our VCA. And we'll connect to the filter output to our VCA again. Right? Just so we can hear the noise going through the filter. Because this is one of the funnest things to do with the subtractive synthesizer, is to create sort of polar winds or ocean kinds of sounds. By simply sending a noise to a filter. And then as you change the cutoff frequency, you simulate those variations in the timbre of the wind, right? If you bring it kind of down with less resonance, it sounds more like the ocean, perhaps. And you can simulate the waves by bringing it up momentarily. Right, that sounds really nice. right? And you can do something rhythmic too. For example, right, we can make it short. And yeah, now maybe we don't want the delay now. And we can do something like, which is kind of like scratching a record, right? And even these nice chunky knobs, you can kind of grab it like you would a record on a turntable. And in this case, the manual gate button is acting like the crossfader that a DJ would use to let the sound through and create the rhythmic aspect of the sound. Okay, cool. So moving on, there are two more modules that we haven't touched on yet. So one of them is the sample and hold. Now let me explain the sample and hold. What a sample and hold does is it takes an incoming voltage and it takes an incoming clock, which is a clock is just a square wave, a slow square wave. It's a pulse that gives you a rhythmic tempo, right? And it has, the sample and hold has its own built-in LFO over here that's acting as its clock. And you can either use, if you put it in free position, the sample and hold is clocked by its internal LFO, and if you put it on gated, it will actually be clocked by the incoming gate, be it the manual gate, the gate via MIDI, or a gate that you send to the gate input in the back of the module here, in the back of the Bullfrog. And what it does is, whenever it receives a clock pulse, it will freeze that incoming voltage and send it to the output until it gets another clock. So if you send like a crazy varying voltage to it, but you send a clock, what the sample and hold will do is turn that freely varying voltage into discrete steps that last as long as each clock step. I don't know if I've explained that very well, but let me show you, let me demonstrate. Let's unpatch everything. I like to start from fresh patch for each idea. A simple way to exemplify this is we're gonna send our mixer to the filter, our filter to the VCA. Right, we'll turn down the noise and we'll turn up a couple of the oscillator waves. We'll bring up that pitch slightly. We'll open up the filter some, right? And now we're gonna send our sample and hold output to control the pitch of the oscillator, right? And right now it's doing nothing because I haven't sent it a voltage for it to read, right? So even if I put it on free here, you don't really hear much change. So what things can I send to that? Well, one thing you can send to it is the noise, because the noise is basically an endless rapid stream of random voltages, and that's what you hear as this noise. But if you use the sample and hold, what it'll do is it'll like take a snapshot of a particular state at the clock pulse. It'll measure that voltage and keep it steady at the output. So then what you hear is a succession of random voltages that are much more discernible because they're slower than the pure noise. So let's send the noise output to our sample and hold input here. Oh, of course, I'm like, oh, what did I do wrong? Yeah, the volume. Right, the noise is attenuator all the way, so we need to bring it up to start getting variation. And instead of using the output here, we're just going to use the pulse output because we don't want the noise to go, we don't want it to be audible, we don't want to hear it, we only want to use it for the sample and hold. And the louder I make the noise, the wider the variation of notes. So you're hearing like a random sequence, right? If I make the clock slower, you can really hear how the sample and hold is sampling the incoming noise voltage and holding the value at the output until the next clock cycle, right? If I put this on gated, it'll wait for me to gate it, so I can manually create these variations. Now I can use the in free mode again and use the pulse output over here to trigger one of my envelope generators, right? And then send that to my VCA. So now we have the rate of change synchronized to the rate of triggering, right? To the rhythmic triggering of our synth. Very cool, right? And I can make this guy into an LFO again, just for fun, create variation on the filter. And I can add some delay now. And why not make this higher pitch? And now we have like that classic 50s sci-fi movie kind of computer sound, right? Whenever you saw like an onboard computer in a spaceship in an old movie, you'd kind of hear this sound, right? In fact, it's not too different from the R2-D2 sound from Star Wars. In addition to all the automatic modulation that I'm creating here, I can use my hands to control certain things. Especially the delay time is fun to control. Because it creates kind of pitch changes as well, right? Isn't that a nice patch? Now, this is random, but if I wanna, instead of creating a random thing, I can turn an LFO into a stepped LFO, right? Because the LFO is a continuous change. If I sample and hold it, you will now get like a step ladder kind of thing. Oh, look, it's my finger. My finger is acting as a voltage source, kind of a random one. That's nice. In fact, I can use the noise. If I touch the tip of the noise cable, it goes through my body and into the sample and hold circuit. See here, they let go. These are fun things that you can play around with, because this is actually an analog synthesizer and is dealing with voltages, which is physics. So you can do strange things that would be unexpected. But anyway, what I was actually trying to demonstrate was using the LFO, right? So let's grab that. So now you can hear how it goes up and down. And it holds each step kind of as a solid pitch rather than this continuous change, right? So that's another use of the sample and hold. Instead of using it for random voltage, you can use it to make a stepped LFO by using the envelope generator over here. Alright, let's go back to the noise here. So I hope these things are starting to make sense. I know maybe I'm going a little fast, but you can watch the video many times, read the manual, and slowly but surely get a grasp over these concepts and ideas. So what a divider does is exactly that. It divides. Right? So if you send a clock or any kind of oscillation to the input, you get divisions of that rhythm on the output, right? And for rhythmic stuff, it can be interesting. For example, if you have 4 percussion voices that you want to trigger, you can send a clock, like a fast clock, to the input, and then you can have the first division be the hi-hat, the second division be a snare, and then the third division be a kick drum, and that way you generate a rhythm. So it'd be like don't that, right, where the hi-hat is happening on every beat. The kick is on every 4 beats, and the snare on every 2 beats, or the other way around rather. Anyway, so that's one way to use this divider if you're using a clock. This synth doesn't have that many voices available. We only have 1 VCA, so it's not really what it's here for. It's here for doing that in audio rate. So remember I was telling you about the octaves, how one octave, a higher octave is always double the frequency of the previous octave, right? So it also follows that if you have a high pitch and you divide it by 2, you get the octave below that. You divide it by 4, you get an octave below that. You know, divided by 8, you get an octave below that, and so on. So what we can do is send our pulse wave to the divider, and then have a mix of octaves. Different octaves that we can access, and then we can route them to our mixer over here and use them that way. So let's check that out. So again, let's unpatch everything quickly. This is a nice thing about the simple synth, is that unpatching takes no time at all. Okay, so now we're going to send the pulse out, right? Let's bring up the volume, and let me get a slightly longer cable. We'll send our pulse out to the divider. Right, and now if I turn down the frequency here, you can start to see how this one's this one is and this one's and this one is so they're being divided by 2, right? This one divided by 2, this one divided by 2, this one divided by 2. So now this is rhythmic right now because I have a super low frequency on my oscillator, but if I bring it up now, this will be audible as octaves, mixed octaves. So basically what we have to do, let's send the audio to the VCA here from the mixer, and now we will use 2 inputs of our mixer. We're bypassing, right? We're bypassing the normalization by plugging cables into the inputs of the attenuators. So this is no longer sine, and this is no longer noise. Basically, they're going to be divisions or octaves. Okay. So here we have the original pulse, right? Which is going through the mixer, and from the mixer also triggering the divider here. And now we have an octave below and 2 octaves below that. We can change, right? We can use different parts of the divider for different combinations of sounds. And this is very cool. This is a different sound altogether. If we send it to the filter, then we can remove some of that harshness from it being square wave oriented. Right? Audio in. Oh, this is CVL. We want the VCF up. Right? So we get 3 octaves happening now. Now, why don't we control the pitch with the keyboard and also trigger an envelope generator that will trigger the VCA. Alright, I'm in the arpeggiator. So that's an example of what you can do with the divider, right? Let's remove the ARP. Just go to sequence here. This is a much beefier sound because now you have 3 octaves happening simultaneously. And you can do a pretty gnarly, badass bass. right? Now, I think I have talked about all of the modules, all of the ins and outs here. Now you may be asking, hey Kinkas, what is this thing over here? Well, first of all, this thing over here is a speaker. It's not a great speaker, but it's fun if you carrying your Bullfrog around. You can just plug it in and already hear without having to plug it into anything. But I do recommend you plug it at least into the kind like one of those JBL Bluetooth speakers that have auxiliary input. Those will sound really nice. Or amplifier, studio monitors, anything, any decent kind of speaker will be a better option than using the built-in one, which is just a nice extra, but it really doesn't do the instrument justice. It sounds way better than it does through here. In fact, if I unplug this and I'll get my mic closer, yeah, you can kind of hear it, right? It sounds more like a toy that way, but when you have it connected, as I do right now, to my audio interface, where it's getting recorded to my computer, and lastly, I will talk about the card slot. So Erica Synths a while ago made an instrument called the Pico System 3, and in fact in my channel I made quite a few videos for the Pico System 3. And the fun thing about the Pico System 3 is that it came with these kinds of cards, like this one, like this thing right here. And what this does is it gives you all of the patch points, and you can solder. If you know how to solder, you can make connections between the patch points and basically mimic a patch that you would make with cables. You'd make it on this thing and have it, you write a name on it, and it's a patch memory basically. You can stick it into the slot and it'll make all the connections that you made here via the slot. If you have a bunch of these, you can have one for the R2D2 patch, one for the sample and hold with LFO patch, one for a keyboard kind of patch, one for the octaves with the divider, and so on. If you're thrifty, you can even add like potentiometers and things in between connections to give you more control. So you can be very creative and expand the synthesizer by just learning how to solder a few cables. It's not a big deal. You can watch my videos from the Pico system about to see how I made preset cards for that system, and it's the same idea here. Now your Bullfrog will come with a few. I don't have all of the available cards yet. They weren't all ready when I got my prototype, but I have a few. I have 3 over here. So one of them is a sequencer. And so this one actually has additional circuitry inside that creates a sequence. And it's a 5-step sequencer. You can also change it to 4 or 3 steps. And you can use the LFO as a clock or the gate as a clock. So there are switches right on the expansion card. There's buttons for the steps, and there are potentiometers, fader potentiometers, for each step where you can determine the pitch of each step. So let's plug this in. And it also makes the connections for sound to happen, right? So let's put it on LFO here, and we'll put it on 5 steps. We'll turn down the noise for now. And we can turn down the tempo by turning down our LFO here. Maybe a little less delay. And I'm determining the sequence by adjusting the sliders. already you have a little simple sequencer here that you can use. And the buttons, the illuminated buttons, are the on-off buttons for each step. So I can turn off a step here and it'll jump that step. You get silence there. Right? That's what those are for. And this is one of the cards that you get with your system. And it's a lot of fun. Another one that you get, and you can hot swap them. See, there's not really a way that you can damage the synth by inserting cards. This one is called the electric organ, and as already you can see that it's engaging the divider, right? The divider lights up, and it's using the octave idea to create kind of an organ sound, because organs are additive synthesizers. So this has been subtractive so far. Why is it called subtractive? Well, you're starting with an oscillator putting out a very loud note, very rich in harmonics with a harsh sound, and then you subtract volume by using the voltage controlled attenuator, and you subtract frequencies by using the filter. So that's why it's called subtractive. You start, it's kind of like the Michelangelo's David idea. When he made the David, he just removed the excess marble from the marble block, and there was the David, right? Of course, that's self-deprecating of him because there's much more involved. But that's the idea. Your sound is already present in the square, loud wave, and then you turn it into a beautiful David by filtering off some frequencies and controlling the volume. Right, so that's why it's called subtractive. So additive synthesis is the opposite. You add frequencies, right? So you're usually adding harmonics or octaves in this case. So let's control it. We'll turn on the gate here and we'll plug in the pitch here. And that's how it sounds right now. So let's turn up the pitch. No, we want this to be free. A little loud. Let's turn that down a bit. Already this sounds kind of like an organ, right? So let's turn up just one of the drawbars, like on a Hammond. So you get this kind of flutish kind of a sound. Let's bring up the next one. Now the next one. And lastly this one. So it sounds like one of those older transistor organs, right? Like a Farfisa or a Continental. Right? And you can get very different kinds of tones by changing the relationship, the volume, the relative volumes of the different overtones or octaves. Maybe more delay. Basically, this is a preset card that makes the patch for you and adds potentiometer control on the card itself for volume. There's also this fun happy face, which is just the basic subtractive patch. It just connects the envelopes to VCA and filter, the mixer to the filter, and the filter to the VCA. Those connections that we made when we first started the video today. So those are quickly made. So if you want to just play some notes, play a bass line or whatever, you don't need to necessarily make those patches. You can just stick this card in there. And again, any other patch that you really love, you can simply learn to solder some little cables here. This card actually has spaces where you can actually put an op amp, a couple of chips in there, and make a mixer or a buffer you know, for more advanced kind of personalization. There's even a kludge area over here where you can put transistors, resistors, and do whatever you want, diodes, and so on. But what I've been thinking of doing is actually putting like pins on these little holes, and then using tiny little strip board cables to make the connections, and then have preset cards that are not permanent, so to speak. So you can remove some of the cables and change their positions and change your patch. So you can just make the patch on the synth and then copy the connections. The layout is exactly the same as the synth itself. Great idea, brought over from the Pico System 3. And that, my friends, is it. I hope you liked this video. I hope you're loving your Bullfrog. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below, and I try to answer in a timely manner any questions that are asked in my videos. If you like the channel, please hit like, hit subscribe, and go check out some more of my videos. There's a bunch of them in the Synth DIY Guy playlist. And that's it. See you soon, and stay noisy.